Hey team, and welcome back to the channel. So normally we'd be getting together to talk about elections following this Taurus lunar eclipse. We don't really have any, so instead I wanted to sit down and talk with you guys about a related sort of like astrological topic and a question that I get a lot when it comes to elections. And the question is usually something like, aren't planets in their domiciles or exaltations shielded from the effects of combustion? So the reason why this comes up is because when we are electing, when we're making elections for talisman making, we avoid the planet that we're working with, or the planet that the moon is applying to, being combust. That's just like a general rule. We avoid it. That planet is not going to do us any good. And that's just the way it is. And that's just how it goes. But it's not a problem necessarily until we get to like a planet being in domicile or exaltation. So kind of like now, what's happening now is Mars is in Scorpio. The sun is very close by. So Mars in Scorpio is combust. I don't like to use combust planets. I stay away from them. I think they're generally bad. Or maybe not, they're not generally bad, they're just generally unproductive, which is not what we want for talismans. But in a situation like this, there's always somebody who has been reading like from the Hellenistic material, or learning from somebody who's more heavily invested in the Hellenistic tradition, who is quick to point out, oh, actually, planets that are in domicile or exaltation, they're in their chariot, they're not affected by combustion, so we can use them. And I don't like this idea for two primary reasons, which we are going to talk about. And I'm going to answer this question about why I still stray away from combustion and why you should too, regardless of the sign that it occurs in. So first, let me introduce the concept a little bit better than that. We do have some references from the Hellenistic tradition, like Rhetorius the Egyptian, and in Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, I believe, as well, this thing called Chariot. The idea that a planet under the rays of the sun or combust the sun is weakened unless it is in a sign that it does well in which case it is like somebody traveling in a chariot or under an umbrella that shields them from the oppressive effects of the sun. And so this typically happens in either, like I said, domicile or exaltation, but I believe Ptolemy makes a allowance for it to also occur in the planet's term. That might be Rhetorius. Anyway, I'm sure like term comes up in there somewhere. And so that's kind of that's like the definition of the concept. A planet that is combust of the sun, but is also in a sign of domicile exaltation. It is in its chariot, and it is said to be protected from it. I don't think this works. That has not been my experience with it. I don't think it works conceptually, kind of for two main reasons. The first is that I think it tries to ignore, to some extent, like what is happening. So by that I mean, you have to kind of take a step back and think about like what's actually happening with this. Why do we say that a planet that's combust is weakened? Well, when planets get too close to the sun, when they get kind of within this combustion orb, which is usually about like 7.5 degrees, they're invisible. They're no longer able to be seen at any time, day or night. And so for a practice like astrology that focuses very much on visualization, like astrology is like, the science of light, having a planet no longer be seen at all is kind of important. Like that's a big deal. And it has certain implications of like weakness or invisibility, and kind of the idea is that the sun sort of oppresses or takes on, like kind of overshadows to some extent that planet and kind of does its job for it to some extent. This one I don't have so much of an issue with in regards to Chariot, because I think it tracks that a planet can be like hidden and invisible and weakened and still be doing things or do things differently depending on the sign that it's in. But the other kind of big thing is that combustion is one part of the synodic cycle with the sun. So the synodic cycle is a planet cycle from one conjunction of the sun to the next conjunction of the sun. And traditionally we reference this, or like we analogize it with a human lifespan. So planets are born when they separate from the sun. They live throughout their youth as they apply to the opposition of the sun. They experience middle age as they oppose the sun. They experience old age as they go from the opposition to the conjunction of the sun, and they die upon the conjunction of the sun. That's sort of like the bullet points version of the synodic cycle. There's more to it, but that's sort of like the bullet points version. The basic idea is that a planet in combustion is weakened. A planet that's conjoined the sun is dead to some extent. It returns its light to the sun, it gets a new spark, and it travels around again. So combustion happens in kind of two places. It happens as the planet leaves the sun, which is associated with like being born and sort of like the vulnerability of infancy and like its helplessness. And then as a planet is moving into the combustion of the sun, which is more associated with like disease, the end of life, and death. And this is where I have a problem with Chariot more so, because synodic cycle in general is something that's happening outside of the zodiac. Like no, like no sign of the zodiac is impacting the synodic cycle, right? It's happening just sort of like around the zodiac or kind of within it, but it's not really related to the zodiac. It's just the planet and its relationship with the sun and that cycle of, you know, life, death, and rebirth kind of a thing. And this is sort of just always happening. Like the planet is always being born, it's always dying, it's always being reborn. This is just sort of the cycle that it goes through. And the zodiac doesn't really impact it much because like when you're dead, you're dead. Like that's just it. That's all there is to it. And a planet being in its own sign of domicile is not going to stop it from having to restart that cycle. It doesn't keep the cycle going. It doesn't prolong the cycle. That planet still experiences that like extinguishment, that union with the sun, and that rebirth upon separation from the sun. That symbolism is still going to be baked in there, and it just kind of like happens in the background constantly. And the sign of the zodiac isn't going to really impact that or change it. And so this kind of leads us to the second reason why I don't really like Chariot very much, and it's because that I think it competes with and is not compatible with reception doctrine, which is much more significant or important in astrology in general. So the kind of bullet point overview of reception is basically that a planet treats other planets differently depending on what sign it's in. So, for example, Jupiter treats planets that are in Sagittarius, Pisces, and Cancer, his signs of domicile and exaltation, better or more favorably than he treats planets that are in Virgo or Gemini, his signs of detriment. And that's in Capricorn too. He doesn't like planets in Capricorn. And that's kind of the basic idea. Planets receive other planets in their domiciles and are more attentive and attendant to them, and they reject or refuse planets that are in their signs of debility, and they don't want to work with them. So where the Chariot concept kind of conflicts with reception theory is that it flips it around. So in reception, you have one planet that owns the sign, and they are the host planet, and it's their job to accommodate, to provide for, and to accept the planets that are in their signs. So like Mars has to provide for, accept, and work with planets that are in Scorpio and Aries, for example. That's his job. That's why we typically want aspects between planets that are in a sign and their ruler. That's the dispositorship doctrine, that planets are able to be kind of reinforced or assisted by their ruler through an aspect. Chariot flips these around and says that Mars in Scorpio is the big boss, and other planets that are in Scorpio or Aries have to do what Mars says. And that's just not how it works. So we have this conjunction with Mars and the Sun where they're trying to end their cycle, where the Sun is trying to like end Mars' cycle and kill it. And of course, the first idea might be, well, Mars is in his house. He can just protect himself from it. And it's like, well, you know, you can be attacked in your own home, right? Like you can die at home. That's not going to stop you. And I think kind of that same logic applies to combustion and to the Chariot. So I don't really like the Chariot idea because I don't think you can be shielded from the end that the combustion implies. Like I don't think you can be shielded from it. But I will also allow that there can be a difference to some degree in, you know, like there's definitely a difference in, you know, dying at home and dying somewhere else. And so I think that might be something worth exploring to it, kind of like thematically or like interpretationally. But the idea that Chariot just like completely blocks out combustion, that it completely like makes it not a problem, has a lot of problems, both from like the visibility standpoint, what combustion and the conjunction with the sun mean in the synodic cycle, and sort of like the flipping of reception doctrine, which is actually kind of interesting because by the time we get to Saul bin Bashir, we actually do see kind of a similar Chariot concept, but flipped to where now instead of planets being protected from combustion or being treated better through combustion, if they're in their signs of domicile, which is what Chariot says, Saul bin Bashir is like, oh, well, actually, planets that are in Aries and Leo go through the combustion process less excruciatingly than otherwise because the sun receives them and has to be nicer to them. And that's more in line with reception theory. I don't know if I believe that necessarily either, just because I think that combustion and the synodic cycle is just a thing that happens and we have to accept it. and you can't just be shielded from it. Like you can't just be shielded from it. You had like your cycle has to come to an end, but that there might be some qualitative differences between kind of like I said earlier, like dying at home or dying in a place where, you know, the king who executes you has to treat you nicely rather than just like dying in some faraway land like being Peregrine would kind of bring to mind. So those are my kind of thoughts and arguments about combustion and Chariot and why I don't think Chariot is a good concept to work with. I was very happy to discover Chariot kind of disappearing from the astrological tradition and kind of only being a thing that we find in the Hellenistic tradition, because I never really thought it made a lot of sense. But it is a great question because this is, you know, material that we read and reference, and it's important to kind of be able to understand what we're talking about and why we do things, why we choose to do things. One of the best pieces of advice that I can give anybody who is looking to like study astrology, particularly traditional astrology, and really kind of understand or learn what to do and what not to do, is always to ask why. Like why do we have this concept? What does this concept mean? And kind of come to terms with what you believe is the best argument for a thing. Because if you just try to judge what you should do based on like a reference that you find in a book, you're going to be really confused, because you're going to have a lot of instances where different authors in different time periods say contradictory things. And so all you can really do is try to understand the logic that they're applying to what they're doing and come to an agreement about which argument is the strongest and go with that. Like, as long as you can kind of fortify your position on something, then it doesn't matter what some author in an old book says. What matters is the argument that they're making and how well that argument and the implications behind it mesh with the philosophy or way that you work with astrology. That's really the most important part. So I recommend doing that. Ask why, try to understand the logic behind things, and pick which argument you think is better or works best with your own kind of worldview or practice. But all right, thank you guys so much for being here and listening to me rant about combustion. The synodic cycle is endlessly fascinating and something I really recommend everybody look into. If they're not already familiar with it, it's very cool. And I hope to see you guys all again on our Gemini new moon.